Dan here. Welcome back. So, this is a brief lecture for week 8, and this covers chapter 7 in our book. And last week we read about the end of World War II. So, now we're going to talk about the beginning of the Cold War. This chapter is broken into 4 sections. The first section talks about the collapse of the Grand Alliance. This picture is great because you see Roosevelt and you see Stalin and you see Winston Churchill. That's the Grand Alliance during the war. But there's a split after the war. And the split is when the communist country, the Soviet Union, Russia, USSR, breaks apart ideologically from the rest of the alliance, which is France, Great Britain, Canada, and the US, and the other allied countries. And really, the Cold War is about ideological differences. And so that's something, if you walk away from nothing else out of this chapter, know that the Cold War is based on ideological differences. And the way it starts, and the book covers this in one of the first questions in the chapter, is, why did the Cold War start? Why did the U.S. and the USSR become suspicious of each other after World War II? And what happened between 45 and 49 that exacerbated those tensions? The two biggies were really the atomic bomb and the occupation of Eastern Europe. President Truman, who was president after Roosevelt passed away, chose not to tell Stalin that we had the atomic bomb before we used it, and sort of surprised Russia by ending the war in the Pacific the way we did. Stalin didn't like that for a number of reasons, which you can read about in the book. But definitely, not only our use of the atomic bomb, but our development of the atomic bomb exacerbated tensions between 1945 and 1949. So that was one cause of the Cold War. And then second of all, which really speaks to this bigger idea of ideological differences, the Russians took over all of these Eastern European countries when the war ended. In other words, Russia physically came through a lot of Eastern European countries to attack Germany with the Red Army, and they didn't leave a lot of those countries. So Hungary's a good example, Poland's a good example, Austria, all of those countries right after the war went communist. The USSR installed these puppet governments in most of them, and that didn't make the U.S. happy or the other Western European countries, because they felt like the entire world was going to fall to communism, and that's command and control type government with dictators, and that's not what the U.S. or the rest of the Western world wanted to see happen. They didn't believe in it. So that's your ideological part, okay? The Cold War is really this war about communism versus democratic, capitalistic societies with free elections. So that's really important, and that's what happens right after the war to cause these greater suspicions between the two superpowers. The other thing that happened was the Cold War in Asia. A chapter or two ago, we read about this gentleman, Mao Zedong, and the fact that he rallied the peasants in the 30s and 40s to form this giant communist party in China. And after all of the fighting, the communists finally take over in 1949 after World War II. This is an interesting picture. This is Mao Zedong, who is the communist leader of China, but this is W.E.B. Du Bois. All right, and he's an African American, and he's actually the first African American ever to get a doctorate degree at Harvard for history. W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm sure you read about him. He's very famous in the civil rights movement early on. But it's a great picture because of these two very different people getting together. So I think it's kind of cool. Anyway, the communists come to power in China, so that makes the Cold War even worse, because now the U.S. is like, holy mackerel. We have Russia, who's this huge country, huge army, and now we have China, this huge country with a huge army, and they're both communists. So that's not great at all, not good news. So, these things are happening in Asia. It intensifies Cold War tensions, and the Korean War starts. All right, in Asia. So that's another Asian event. And again, the Korean War is about keeping communism out of Korea. And today we have North Korea and South Korea for that reason. North Korea obviously being communist and closed, and South Korea not. So that's one of the things that happened in Asia. The Vietnam War is another one of these proxy wars that happens in Asia. And I have to mention Ukraine here. Ukraine's obviously not in Asia. Nothing was going on in Ukraine during this period because they were under the thumb of the USSR. But I mention it here because in some sort of way, Ukraine right now is a proxy war for the U.S. because we're supplying them with weapons in an effort to stop communism from taking over Ukraine again. So it's sort of this rebirth of the Cold War, and it sort of fits in with this idea of Vietnam and the Korean War because of our support for Ukraine. There was a softening of the Cold War in the mid 50s when Khrushchev took over for Stalin. Austria was able to get out of the communist network. Khrushchev actually came here in the U.S. and toured the country, went to Hollywood. There's all kinds of great pictures out there online that you should go look at, and the book talks about it. And there were cultural exchanges and some cool stuff. A meeting at Camp David with Ike and some other stuff. So really, the Cold War started to thaw a little bit in the mid '50s, but then in the early '60s. It rekindles again with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I have our little map here. The Cuban Missile Crisis in the early '60s, '63 is when Cuba, or when the USSR puts nuclear missiles in Cuba. Cuba has fallen to the communists at this point with Castro, so there's a lot of tension there. And Cuba's only like 100 and 200 miles from Florida. So with these nuclear missiles, now all of a sudden all of our major cities were in the range of being hit. That rekindled Cold War tensions when Kennedy was in office, and then the Vietnam War is going on, or going to start at the same time. So under LBJ, so really the Cold War tends to thaw in the '50s, but then sort of ramps up again in the early '60s into Vietnam. Until the 1980s. And in '85, Mikhail Gorbachev takes office. He's in this picture with Ronald Reagan. And he understands that the Soviet Union has to change because they're about to go broke. Russia has a very small economy, smaller than Texas. Even today, they have a very small economy. They can barely support their war machine, and the only thing they really sell is oil. And Gorbachev knew that they could not continue to fund the governments of all of Eastern Europe as they were doing after World War II. So Gorbachev takes over this, and he enacts this strategy called perestroika, which is called restructuring, and it starts to open up markets and to sort of normalize relations, or starts to normalize relations with other countries. And finally, the Berlin Wall is going to fall, but we don't talk about that until Chapter 9. So the Cold War is going to end in 1989 for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that the USSR was going broke. For sure. So we'll talk about that a little more. It's bizarre talking about this because now the Cold War is back in high gear with Ukraine, and it's interesting to see what's going to happen there. So let's get to the quiz review real quick. The quiz is super easy this week. All you need to know are these things. First of all, know that the Cold War was based on ideological differences. Know that Vietnam and Korea were both about the U.S. trying to contain communism. Super easy. All right. Neither one of these countries at the time was really of strategic importance to the U.S. because we had possessions in the East and in Asia. But at the same time, because of this fear of what they call the domino theory, that if one country falls, all the countries are going to fall to communism, the U.S. was really interested in keeping communism out of Vietnam and out of Korea, so know that. The next thing you need to know is make sure you understand that Mao Zedong was a communist leader in China and Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of the Chinese nationalists. In the big picture, I don't know why this question is really important, but it's sort of a trick question, so make sure you understand that Chiang Kai-shek was sort of the good guy with the nationalists and Mao Zedong was sort of the bad guy with the Communist Party. Second of all, Cold War tensions. Okay, I told you, and we're sticking with this idea that the Cold War was based on ideological differences. That was the basis for it, but it was exacerbated. It was made more intense by nuclear weapons and the Cuban Missile Crisis and other ideological differences. So this is a multiple choice question on the quiz. It's super easy, but I wanted to review it with you. So that's it for this week. I apologize for this being such a short lecture. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great day. Stay safe. Bye-bye.